Well, if you are ready, Mr. Huerta, I would love to start this video interview. I would just first of all like to thank you for joining us today. Um,
Sure, pleasure.
we are so lucky to have you, and just during this chaotic time during COVID-19, I'm just so glad that you took time out of your day to speak with us. And I see you're home, so I hope you and your family are staying healthy and safe.
Oh yeah, we all are, and same to you as well.
Thank you so much. So just for a little bit of introductions, I'm Maddie Bunting, and joining me today is fellow ambassador of the UCR School of Public Policy, Sam Roberts.
Yeah, so before we begin this interview, I'd quickly like to introduce you, Mr. Huerta. So for the audience, Mr. Huerta was the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration from 2013 until 2018. He is an experienced transportation official who has held key positions across the country, including serving as managing director of the 2002 Olympic Winter Games, as commissioner of New York City's Department of Ports, and as the executive director of the Ports of San Francisco.
Wow, impressive. So during this trying time amid COVID-19, the economy has been on everyone's mind for a lot of reasons, and certain industries have been in the news that are possibly struggling more than others, and that's including airlines. I feel like most vacations have, or air travel has come to a halt. So what do you believe is the probability of airlines going bankrupt by May? This is something I've seen in the news, and I would love to hear your input on.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. Let me take a minute and talk about what the impact has been and kind of what makes it different from challenges that we have seen in the past. First of all, the airline industry and the aviation industry generally is a pretty significant part of the economy. There are a lot of estimates out there, but the one that most people cite is that it's about 5% of the gross domestic product. So it is a very large segment of the US economy. And it is an industry that is highly capital intensive, highly sensitive to fuel costs, but it's also a very important indicator of how the economy is doing overall. The airline industry, as a sector, has a lot in common, but there are a lot of differences between airlines. And I think that what we are seeing is how the individual airlines are reacting provides some sense of how they were set up actually going into the crisis. Overall, though, the traffic levels are quite dramatic. I think that many airlines are seeing traffic today that would represent something on the order of 5% of what they would have seen on the same day last year. So that gives you a sense of just what that impact has been across the industry overall. In terms of how an airline will deal with this, the principal thing that every airline is trying to do is, in light of just completely collapsing revenues, that what they're trying to do is reduce their costs as much as possible and secure credit and other support to enable them to build up their cash reserves so that they're able to wait out this particular impact. I think everyone acknowledges that once we're through this, once we get to the other side of it, that traffic will rebound. Personally, I don't think it'll rebound to the levels it has been at for quite some time, but there will be a rebound that comes back. What we don't really know is when that will be, and so that's why there's such a focus on generating cash. An airline's ability to do that is going to be driven to a large extent by how much debt they were carrying going into this particular crisis. And here you have a lot of differences among them. There are some airlines that have been making a lot of investments in new aircraft, in new markets, new routes, new facilities at airports and so forth. And consequently, they would, particularly if they've been buying a lot of aircraft, they would be carrying a lot of debt and a lot of their assets would be pledged as collateral against that debt. That's great when you're in a growing economy. But when you are in a downturn, what that means is your assets are pretty much pledged already. And so you don't have a lot of assets that you're able to offer as collateral to generate credit facilities to help you get through a significant downturn. On the other hand, if an airline has a much more mature operation, perhaps older aircraft, they will have a relatively lighter level of debt. And so that will give them the ability to secure other credit that would take them through a downturn like this. The other thing that you have to consider is the market they're in. A large network carrier is by definition going to have a much larger set of fixed costs just because of the size and scope of their operations. Mm-hmm. In addition, you also have to consider the markets they serve, because that's critical for understanding when they will come back once we are through this crisis. For example, large international carriers might have one set of things that they're concerned about, whereas a largely domestic carrier will have a completely different set of things. And it all depends on what you believe. Most economists believe that once we're through this, that our domestic traffic will rebound more quickly. That tends to favor carriers that are largely domestic in operation in terms of their ability to come out of this. On the other hand, international travel tends to be more business traffic. And there is also a question of, will you see business or leisure travel respond more quickly once we're through this? I tend to think it will be business travel, largely because of the broader impacts on the economy. So if a carrier has primarily a business base of travelers, they will be better situated as business returns to normal. Whereas people who have been laid off or have family members who have been laid off, they're going to be very focused for quite a while about replenishing their bank accounts, getting their finances in order before they're going to be thinking of taking an airline trip to go on vacation. And so all this is a long way of saying that I don't think you can make a general statement about how the industry overall will do. I think it's very airline specific, and a lot of it's going to be driven by the markets they're in and their own financial position going into that, as we've just talked about.
Great, thank you so much for your response. I know that you mentioned and you touched on this about there being less travel post COVID-19 than there was pre-COVID-19, and you mentioned, of course, business versus domestic. But I'm also wondering, do you think another fear that people are going to start facing when considering air travel is also the transmission and spread of these diseases on airplanes? Do you think that's going to be something that affects that sort of factored into, I guess, a cost-benefit analysis of whether to go on a plane to another country? Is that going to, do you think, reduce the amount of people traveling to international countries as well?
I think there's a good chance of that. And I think it has a lot to do with just how much is not known about coronavirus that we're talking about here. I think that the public has pretty short memories and will respond pretty quickly if they have a clear understanding of what caused the problem. In this case, there is a lot of information that we don't have in terms of, is there a vaccine? It has been an evolving story about how the virus is transmitted. Initially it was thought to be people that were displaying very significant symptoms. And then shortly after that, we all learned that actually people could be highly contagious, but displaying no symptoms at all. And then there is the whole uncertainty with respect to testing. And so even, you or I don't know if we haven't been tested, whether we're contagious or not. We may feel absolutely fine. And so I think a lot of it will depend on how far the science has gotten when in the months and possibly the next year ahead. As we're thinking about, will we have more robust testing? So we'll have a more definitive view on what the actual infection rates are and fatality rates are in the population as a whole. If there's a vaccine, I think that leads to a much quicker recovery, because then the public will have confidence that they are appropriately protected against something like this. So, but I do think every expert I'm hearing from says that all of that takes time. That a vaccine can be 12 to 18 months, that testing, I think we're hearing conflicting messages as to what the availability of testing really is and what it would take to get the entire population tested. So I think that as long as there is that uncertainty out there, there will be some segment of the public that will say, I just don't want to take a trip. And so I think everyone in the airline industry is expecting that we will come out of this smaller. And then it is a question about for how long we will be smaller, and what that rate of growth to the levels that we have been at for the last couple of years, how long it'll take to get back to that.
Does healthcare play a role in keeping employees on too? Because I know here in the US, right, most healthcare is employer-based. So is that another reason as to why they want to keep employees on too?
Well, I'm sure that that's certainly a factor, because that is a broader fear across other sectors of the economy, that at the same time people are, in times of greatest need, they're also losing their jobs. And for many, that means they are losing healthcare at a time when our health facilities are being stretched to the limit. And so there are downstream effects on the healthcare sector and its financial health, as it's trying to treat large numbers of people, and perhaps increasing percentage of which may not have health insurance.
Definitely.
Thank you. So adding on to that, so if airlines can avoid bankruptcy with help from the CARES Act and from their own individual position pre-COVID-19, what will it look like if airlines are forced to consolidate or shut down?
Well, there are a couple of things that were in the CARES Act that are relatively small provisions, but they are very important. One is that Treasury is supposed to work with the Transportation Department in structuring support to the sector to ensure that there continues to be some level of support to smaller communities. One of the big fears is that if there is a contraction of the airline industry coming out of this, that the locations that will lose service or see greatly reduced service will tend to be smaller, more remote areas, which then creates yet another economic factor that they need to overcome to recover. And so I think the policymakers are trying to strike a balance between providing support for the workforce, maintaining some base level of service, and ensuring, though, that companies are strong enough to come out of this. Is there the likelihood that there will be some consolidation coming out of this? I wouldn't rule it out, simply because the industry had grown so large and it has declined so significantly, just really in a matter of weeks. I think it's probably fair to ask the question, are we going to have long-term excess capacity? And does the industry need to rationalize itself in order to be able to adapt to what is going to be the new normal. We're seeing some of that in other countries already. There are particularly some of the newer so-called upstart carriers that are very low fare carriers in places like Europe or in Asia, where they're carrying very heavy debt loads. They operate on very thin margins, and as the market has really dried up, they have found that they're not able to sustain and continue to operate. I think it's a little different here in the US, largely because the industry has gone through a lot of consolidation. And so, where we used to have larger numbers of carriers, what we have now are, about 4 big, very large carriers, and then the next tier of another 3 or 4 that, so we are a much more consolidated industry than we were, say, 20 or 30 years ago. Where I do think there are challenges are the regional carriers. These are the ones that operate generally as contract carriers for the main lines, providing service such as Airline A Express or Airline A Connection. And there are very large ones. There are also smaller and less financially robust ones. And so it wouldn't surprise me to see consolidation in the regional sector. We've already seen one that has ceased operations. And it wouldn't surprise me if we saw more of that.
I wanted to ask Mr. Huerta, I was previously speaking with public policy professor Richard Carpiano. He's a population health scientist and medical sociologist about COVID-19, and he compared it, different fields, but in a sense to 9/11, of the country coming together after this and with the government and coming up with new policies. And I just wanted to ask you, is there any comparison that you might see policy-wise with 9/11 or the recession in relation to the airline industry?
This feels a lot worse than 9/11, as discouraging as that sounds. I mean, 9/11, it was a tremendous shock to our country. And it was something that all of us who were alive and adults then remember exactly where we were when that happened. But as we came through 9/11, it became very clear what we were responding to, what we were fighting. And with COVID-19, I think there is still a lot of debate about what the enemy is and what we know about that enemy and how we respond to that. And unfortunately, I think we also find ourselves at a much more fractured time politically, where we are in a situation where we are used to getting our news from particular sources, and they may be completely different sources than other people get their news from. And so I think that it is harder for us to rise above that and come together. I'm hopeful that we will be able to do that, that as the economy hits bottom and as we can really see the impact that the global community, that our national community will come together to figure out how we're able to address that. I do worry, though, that that there still seems to be a lot of debate that seems to be much more focused on what an individual or a group's political orientation is than about what the actual facts are. And so I think the challenge we're all going to have is to really focus on achieving a common understanding of what we're facing and how will we as a country come together to come out of this.
I had another question. We saw in the bailout that we were mentioning earlier for airlines that there were terms stipulating that the airlines had to follow stricter environmental regulations. Is that something we should expect to see in future bailouts? And do you think that this pandemic could start kind of the next wave of environmental regulations and safety, seeing as we're about to enter into a recession and it's going to drastically restructure the economy? Should we expect to see a cleaner airline industry coming from this?
It's that's actually a really good question. And again, it's another situation where the airlines are in very different places
Mhm.
as they go into this. There are some airlines that have already implemented a lot in the way of fuel efficiency, which is probably where we see the greatest climate impact of airlines.
Mhm.
Many have been experimenting with different ways of getting rid of single-use plastics on board aircraft, which is, obviously another significant impact. And then there have been a lot of investments made in new technologies, such as electric aircraft or other clean fuel technologies, solar projects at airports that can operate 100% of the airport, the airport infrastructure and support all of its power needs. I think some of that will accelerate, but I'm not sure I would draw the cause and effect that because of this, the industry will be a cleaner industry, because I think a lot of that has been ongoing. I think what it will do, if the industry comes out of this smaller and needing to make new investments, all the incentives are aligned to find ways to reduce the carbon footprint of the industry, because that's what the public wants. At the end of the day, people want to be able to travel, but they want to feel good about traveling. And they want to feel that they're patronizing companies that are in a responsible way dealing with their environmental footprint. And so I don't know that it was necessary to dictate that the industry do more of this, because a lot of that is going on because, frankly, it's good business.
Yeah.
But what the flying public wants to see is an industry that is becoming cleaner and more environmentally responsible.
I wanted to ask Mr. Huerta, I know myself, along with probably many people, had airplane tickets lined up for the coming months, unaware that COVID-19 would occur and we would be basically, or should be, told to not travel and to stay home. And I know there's been a lot of public conversation about getting refunded or, just working with the companies to get your money back. It seems from what you were saying earlier that this is an individual airline decision, if they will refund your money. Could you go further into maybe the airline company's thought process of whether they refund or exactly what happens in that thinking?
Yeah, it's they're trying to find a balance between preserving cash, which is prepaid tickets, and having that available in order to support their overall operation as they go through, and not alienating you as a customer. And they have adopted different philosophies. I'm aware of one airline that is providing a refund to anyone who asks for it. Essentially, what they will, and their view is, if they've canceled the service, that you should be entitled to a refund. Yes, they'll ask you if you want to leave it as a credit, but if you say, no, I'd rather have the refund, they will give you the refund. I know of another airline that is exactly the opposite approach. Their view is that you bought a ticket, you knew it was non-refundable, and maybe they will, relax the conditions under which you need to use it, maybe give you a few extra months, other than the 1 year that they typically have. And but they're going to hold on to the money and count on you coming back to use it. And I think it's driven. So if an airline's in a tight cash position, they may feel they have no choice but to hold on to that as long as they possibly can. Personally, I'm in favor of the more liberal approach. I think that the airlines need to be looking at this for the long term And I think that as we come out of a crisis like this, the public will remember who were the good operators, who were the good corporate citizens that really worked with people to try to adapt to and deal with this incredibly difficult situation that we're facing as a country. And so, I would urge all the airlines to be as liberal as possible in trying to be responsive to their customer base.
So I'm wondering, I know we've talked a lot about the airlines themselves, and I'm a bit unfamiliar with this topic. So this might sound a bit, I don't know if this is a smart question or not, but I'm wondering, what about smaller airports? I know we go to UC Riverside. I live in Santa Cruz, and when I go back to Santa Cruz, I fly out of Ontario Airport. But if we do see these airplane industries, these certain companies filing for bankruptcy and some of the smaller ones going out of business, is that going to put smaller airports at risk of losing, I guess, customers and losing these airlines that usually dock there?
Yeah, I think that is a fear, that smaller communities will lose air service simply because demand will be slow to recover. I mean, Ontario is an interesting case in point. Ontario has, over the last few years, since they've achieved local control, has really, seen quite explosive growth there in Ontario. And I think a lot of it is that they have an incredibly talented management team that has really done a nice job of telling the Ontario story and making the point that for many, many travelers in Southern California, in the Los Angeles basin, Ontario is actually closer and more convenient than going to Los Angeles International Airport.
I can vouch for that.
Yeah, and so a lot of service has come back, and the airlines are very responsive to what the passengers want. Yeah. If the passengers want service from Ontario, the airlines will provide it. And I think that for an airport like Ontario, yes, like everyone else, it's experiencing contraction in passengers that are going through there. But I think that they've had a couple of years of having told the story. And I think that, as the market develops, I think the airlines will be there to restore service. I think it's tougher for small rural communities, say in the center of the country, where they may have a couple of flights to a hub airport, such as a Denver or a Salt Lake City or a Minneapolis. But that service has always been very much on the margin in terms of the passenger loads it carried, the profitability of those routes, and so forth. Those will take much longer to recover, simply because the market demand you're starting at a smaller base, which has declined, and that demand will just take longer to develop. But overall, I think that, for places like Ontario, where you're in a very large populous market, the rebound, I would hope, and it should occur relatively quickly as the overall economy recovers.
Wow, thank you so much. It was wonderful speaking with you. And in this time, that Sam and I were talking earlier, the news is just completely COVID-19 for obvious reasons. And I, to your point with just news outlets, people are receiving a lot of information. So it's so wonderful to have an expert to answer our questions and alleviate some fears. So thank you so much for coming on and speaking with us.
Well, thank you so much, and good luck to both of you as you work on your remote studies, and best of luck to you going forward.
Yeah, and again, we really appreciate it. It was a pleasure talking to you. I know there were a lot of questions that I feel that I had for you that I feel like I hadn't found online, and it was great getting to speak with a professional like yourself, and we really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you. Stay safe.
You too. Take care.
All right. Bye.